customer service. That's Dr. Vanessa Funches. I'm also joined by Colonel Bottomley. Colonel Rock Bottomley currently serves as the Dean of the U.S. Air Force Air War College. He holds a PhD from Auburn University, research focused on leadership and public administration. Oh man, we got Auburn, Alabama. So I'm a Norwich guy, so we got to keep the peace here. Research focused on leadership and public administration before completing an AFIT PhD fellowship, served a year in Kabul, Afghanistan as Director of Air Operations Coordinating Center at the NATO headquarters there, graduate of the U.S. Army War College, Air Command and Staff College, U.S. Air Force Academy, Air Officer Commanding Fellowship PME Program, and Squadron Officer School. He holds 3 master's degrees from the U.S. Army War College, University of Colorado, and Cal State University. He's a command pilot with more than 2,500 hours, including 250 combat hours in F-16 and AT-38 aircraft. So I am joined by some excellent sources here on this topic. So let's start with Dr. Funches. Ma'am, share with us, please, your thoughts on emotional intelligence in leadership and education, and share with us some of your own research, and as well as research that you have found on the topic and you would like to share with us today. And thanks for being here.
I'm sorry. Welcome, everybody. All right, and technology. Emotional intelligence is one of my favorite topics, just because it really touches on so much. And if you've been paying attention to the news, they had some phenom little kid on the other day who was like 4 with an IQ of 149. Totally got me beat. And there's probably not much I'm going to do about that. But the good thing with emotional intelligence is that we have more control over our skills, and we can really, improve them. So as a PhD, I have to start everything out with a definition, right? So emotional intelligence is really our ability to recognize and manage our emotions and the emotions of others. And so you might think, manage other people's emotions. Well, we really have to be able to recognize it. And I think in today's environment, where we know the content, and in some cases, we're really very removed from each other, it's an important skill to know how to draw people in, and as a leader, how to develop people. Our job is not just to manage and direct, it's really to develop and grow personnel and help them to be able to adapt in various settings. And I think that's the beauty of emotional intelligence. So if you're interested in this topic, and hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be incredibly passionate, I would say, figure out what your level of emotional intelligence is. And one of the great tools that I have used in several of my presentations is Mind Tools, Mind, M-I-N-D, tools.com, and look up emotional intelligence. And it has a short quiz you can take where you can assess your skills. And it'll break it down into the areas of self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, and relationship strategies. And so, once you know all of this, then you can really begin to highlight some areas where you're weak and you could possibly improve. And some of the great things, there's tons of material out. Daniel Gottman, I'm saying that right?
Daniel
Goldman, my bad. He wrote a book in 1995, and he's written several others on the topic of emotional intelligence. If that's something that you really want to work on. There is so much out there, though.
Doc, would you find that if someone who's just starting out on their emotional intelligence journey, you mentioned that internal reflection, that personal reflection first. I feel that's kind of like the first step. There's no way around that first step when it comes to the continuum of emotional intelligence. Would you agree on that? And how would you, what would you recommend to folks wanting to get a foothold in this burgeoning science?
One of the most interesting parts, and I assume it's a journey that we're all on. Sometimes I'm corrected that that's not the case. But if you're intentional and really want to improve, self-awareness is the first place where you begin to identify things that get your dander up, or places where you become less productive than you could be. And then really trying to lean into those feelings and figure out kind of what was the source. And then you can find ways to manage. People who are successful, they really have a good skill to start off with in terms of growing their emotional intelligence. For self-awareness, how can I get myself to be productive? I start to wane, and I work in semesters. So, I come on like gangbusters in the beginning of the semester, and then toward the end, I kind of teeter off. And so, of course, over time, I've learned ways to manage that better, where there's not this incredible drop off. And so when I'm talking to students, they're in that place in their lives where they're learning so much about themselves. So it's a good place to introduce emotional intelligence and the idea that you can actually focus on those skills and improve them.
We got a quick question in the chat, Dr. Funches, and Colonel, please, if you have something to add to this, please sign in. Matt Correa says, younger airmen learn differently than through what we would call traditional methods. They use different domains, information access is there, and big on gaming, esports and mobile games. I know that the military has taken a different perspective in valuing gaming much more, but how do you find gaming or gamifying emotional intelligence as an effective way for airmen to develop their emotional intelligence for younger folks? Do you think that's a good way to, if that's
a
what
great question.
It is.
I think different generations will view gaming differently. I think for the strategy and things that happen, I think gaming is a perfect environment to learn. Again, I hear my son plays. I don't really do much, but when he's throwing controllers and this kind of thing, it's a great place for us to discuss his ability to manage his frustration and anger. But on a more serious note, I think the way that I know you can connect and play with others. I think it's an awesome place to figure, what kind of self-talk happens when you're not in the lead, when you're being beaten very badly, and how can you address that, manage that process. I think it's really kind of a microcosm, if you will, of all of the emotions we feel, in regular life. So I think gaming is an awesome way because you get to try again and try again and try again. So it's a good starting ground, I think, for delving into self-awareness and emotional intelligence.
Thank you. Colonel, what do you think?
Yeah, so I agree with the doctor. And so it obviously is a clear way. I do play some games myself, and I can feel it. I've told my sons a while back, I could feel the adrenaline. You can, with some of the games nowadays, as real as they are, unlike when we were younger, playing games where it was really an external experience. Nowadays, the games really have become an internal, you were in that world. So I can feel the adrenaline myself. I can feel my emotions. So I think that's a great exercise. I think a part of emotional intelligence is being able to understand the other person's emotions as well, so that you can see how your emotional response is going compared to the other person's emotional response. And unfortunately, I think with gaming, you don't have that a lot of times. And especially if you're playing against other online gamers. So instead of playing against the computer, you're playing against other online gamers. You don't know that other person, the emotional response that your behavior is having on that other person. So for example, I don't know what it's called, but fratricide. If you intentionally kill one of your own teammates, which happens, especially when somebody gets aggravated at somebody else's behavior, and they do a Leroy Jenkins, I think is what it was called, where they go and intentionally do something that hurts the rest of the team, then you might see somebody who fratricides their own player. And so that's one way of knowing that you just aggravated the other person, is that your own teammate kills you. But other than that, it's a very difficult thing online to know what other people are experiencing emotionally. I think that then relates to the different type of personas, and almost the online bullying that happens a little bit, is that I'm a lot braver online than I would be if I was talking to a person in face to face. And I think part of that comes out of just the emotional aspect, that you can't feel what that other person's feeling. You don't see it necessarily in their face, especially if it's an online character that you're playing. And then we just have a tendency to let our emotions go a little bit wild online and have a difficult time. We exude a lot of emotion, but don't maybe receive that other person's emotion. I'll stop there.
I think that's really the only blind spot in using gaming is that you need feedback onto yourself first. And I used to do an emotional intelligence exercise where I would ask my students, chiefs, to film themselves driving to work one day, and then bring that to class and show. And even though it was a controlled environment, even though they knew they were being recorded, even they knew they faced the scrutiny of their classmates, the amount of profanity and hate and venom just in one stoplight out of Commerce Avenue downtown would reveal. So I think gaming is a great way to do that, because people really come out of themselves in the safety in their homes. But I think the real value in that would be if they got to see how they interacted, their nonverbals. I guess it's the best snapshot is that most impromptu and extemporaneous snapshot of what you're wearing, what you're saying. There's that Big Bang Theory where Penny plays, she's got Cheetos in her hair, and you lose all that self-awareness because you're immersed in the experience. So I think it's a great way, Matthew, thanks for that question, to kind of see where you are. Again, focus on that self first. Sounds counterintuitive to be able to serve an emotional intelligent capacity. You have to turn a little bit more inward first for the people on the journey. That's a great question. We have another quick question while you guys are on, Colonel and Doc. What are your thoughts about out there on the implications in the recent evolution of virtual environment and emotional intelligence in last year? Is there virtual emotional intelligence? That's a good question. I'd pass that one back to you, Doc, real quick.
Is there virtual emotional intelligence? Yes, I think there is. And I know we've talked about the self-awareness, but I think that is the first piece, because once you become aware of yours, you might give you some insight into the way you're coming across to other people. For example, I went out the other day and I realized that I'm sitting and my arms are folded. And so I kind of caught myself, and I could realize why others might think I was a little distant and hard to connect with. So I think there is virtual emotional intelligence. I just think you have to work harder at understanding that. And I think maybe once we understand ourselves to some degree, because that's a lifelong journey, then we get insight into others, or maybe we begin to probe and ask better questions for how others are feeling and why they're behaving in ways. I know we're always, why would anybody do that? That's crazy. Well, you sometimes you really have to go on that journey and begin to ask. So I think it's definitely possible to manage that and to become aware of it. But I think it certainly requires more intentional effort.
And I think from a virtual perspective, we have grown and evolved as a society. I have not seen myself on camera as much as I have been since we had to teach in a remote environment. Never would I thought, having the love of the classroom, that I would ever, I used to hear about instructors say, well, I can't wait till I'm in my boxer shorts at home grading papers. Well, here we are, and you can't get away with that. We are more exposed, I think, in the remote because we're extra self-conscious. So I think it's good and it's bad. It's kind of pointed out some blind spots in our nonverbals and how we look and how we project and how we speak. But in that same aspect, I think it's a great byproduct of the evolution society's gone through as we've kind of isolated and trying to reconnect. Sir, what do you think about the concept, an amazing concept of virtual emotional intelligence?
I would just piggyback on what you were just touching on. That the neat thing is that we've all had an opportunity to experience it this last year. What I've heard from folks that would consider themselves introverts, and so my wife is an introvert, and what she has said is that I found that even though I'm an introvert, I really need to be around people, and that this last year, and so that might just be back to, again, we could start a whole nother discussion over. Going from transitioning from emotional intelligence to extroversion, introversion, which I don't want us to do, not the point to be here, but it goes back to even introverts, even those folks that really do enjoy your personal time, is that we are social creatures. Humans are social creatures, and that we do need time around other people. And part of that interaction that we have with other people is that emotional experience. And so, yes, we can see each other on the camera. That's the nice thing of Zoom and on the Teams videos that we have, is that now we can see some of those verbal cues, but right now you can't see what my hands are doing, down here. And so, like Dr. Vanessa mentioned before, these arms crossed, which are just crossed my arms, you can't see that on the video sometimes. And You can't see when somebody's hands are tapping, down, and you can hear them right now maybe, but you can't hear. And so those type of things where we exude some of our emotional experience with an interaction is that in this two-dimensional experience, you don't always pick that up.
Absolutely.
So thank you, sir. Dr. Funches, I'm interested in your thoughts on the role of emotional intelligence in education. From an educator's perspective, a lot of our audience are instructors or students, and I'm really interested in hear your thoughts from your perspective in the kind of civilian world, speaking to us from a military culture or background, whether civilian service or active duty or total force. What do you think the role of emotional intelligence is in leadership and education, particularly?
I think I think perhaps maybe in the boomer generation, there was an idea that, eventually you would get it. Where I think now we're really having to be explicit in our discussion, having the discussion about emotional intelligence and working to improve those skills. Because what I find is our students come to us and they think, if I just get this college degree, my life is going to be set and I'm going to make, oogles and oogles of money. That is not entirely true, especially in the area of business. It's not just about the content. It's also about soft skills, is the new term everyone uses. It's about your ability to emotionally connect with others. And so it's not just knowing the content. And so we're having to become much more explicit with how these things are important and really kind of laying it out for people. I mean, I think a lot of times we want to get on a collegial or comfortable level with people, but then we also have to then say, well, wait a minute, there's still a way to do this and be professional. And so we're just really having to be much more concrete with that type of information and training people to understand how important it is.
Absolutely. That's part of some of my thoughts I'm going to share here in a little bit with that requirement for how are we raising emotionally intelligent leaders and educators rather than just interjecting elements of emotional or curriculum elements into emotional intelligence, but actually training and certifying instructors to be able to speak on it from more than just a lesson plan or philosophical standpoint. I think it needs to become, especially part of the continuum of training and educating teachers in this topic by giving them some kind of immersion into it. Doc, thanks for your thoughts. Any other questions real quick for Dr. Funches before we press on a little bit? If so, just go ahead and sign off in that chat. I'm monitoring the chat, Joyce, for us if you're listening. So I'm kind of handling it on the fly. So Doc, stay with me a second. I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts from my perspective, from an senior enlisted person's perspective. I first became aware of emotional intelligence way too late in my career. I was a 30-year airman, and in security forces for the vast majority of that before I came to teaching. And what I found particularly profound in emotional intelligence was before, we as instructors were kind of introduced to the curriculum that we were firing. We got to immerse ourselves in these concepts. And what I found particularly important was the idea of deconflicting in our minds the term soft skill versus hard skill. And I think an interesting example of a very glaring example of differing philosophies just happens to be in the recruiting campaigns of some of our strategic peers. We used to call them near peers, but we're understanding that the great power competition is a lot more competitive than we thought. There are certain countries whose recruiting basically is Cold War era, a lot of showing of running, shooting, moving, shooting, communicating, very rough and tumble, gender specific combat roles, as opposed to America's recruiting campaign, which tends to focus on technology, There are current campaigns that focus on the benefits that a family can now enjoy while their spouse or parent serve in the military. We are reflecting society's norms in our military to include different familial structures, different ways of life, different perspectives and orientations. And we think which one is, from a stranger's point of view, an observer's, which one is more effective, which campaign is going to ensure a more effective military. So when you think of soft skills, immediately that bias of passiveness, that bias of weakness, whereas I think if we stick to that traditional military representation of moving, shooting, communicating, gender specific roles, we're missing the fact that the face of warfare is changing. The face of the warrior is changing. My first role was an M60, an A1 Vietnam era machine gun that is no longer in service and is obsolete for very good reason. And there's no reason for me to even be behind that anymore, because now a robot can fire the same machine guns with much more accuracy and less fatigue than myself or even our best machine gunners. We've been kind of outpaced. And with that understanding, in the face of warfare changing and how kinetic effects are carried out on the battlefield, it's not always from the person on the ground. The kill chain is expanded to include a lot of remote technologies. So I think that's the first hurdle for the military, from a military perspective, and an enlisted perspective even more, because I think emotional intelligence is key to becoming that intellectual peer to commanders and officers who we groom and who we train for command and help develop their command vision, as well as our own leadership and management skills. We have to see what we do well and what we don't do well from the beginning. So
business really mirrors that, in the sense that historically we've trained up new business leaders and left out the emotional component, because you're supposed to be a go-getter. The emotion has no place here. But I think we're learning over time that we really have to consider the whole person. And maybe there are places where you're only going to think about dollars and cents in our case, and not the individuals behind it. But we're finding that you can be successful and profitable and consider those things as well. And that's becoming more of the norm. And so we get ourselves in trouble by erasing emotions. Lots of ethical lapses happen in that type of tunnel vision, if you will. So I think more holistically, there are lots of strategies that could be used on the battlefield or in the boardroom. And we need to consider all of it. We're not just non-emotional beings.
Right.
And so I think it's remiss if we don't include the role that emotions can play. That's not to say now that this, we should all be, mamby-pambies and we're all hugging, right? And this kind of thing. But
right.
I think there's certainly a role, and there's a balance that we'll need to find there.
Well, the research that I've read always pointed back to, if there is emotional intelligence enough where leaders provide psychological safe spaces, where leaders can allow for the constructive dialogue and the mining of tacit knowledge, which is the life-saving lessons learned, the below the surface, they use an iceberg, the explicit knowledge someone displays is always above that. And then you have all of this below the surface that's very tacit, very contextualized, highly personal, almost intangible to relay. I think if we can unlock that promotes the innovation and problem solving, resistance to organizational change that is so vital in staying ahead of our strategic and great power competitors. And again, I saw research that when aimed at making emotionally intelligent educators, that if you can do that, if you can get educators to look at themselves and not only embrace everything else we ask them to instruct, but to take on board more personally these ideas of critical thinking and emotional intelligence, of which one of the domains is self-awareness, then they're better qualified to teach it, number one. And number two, the research, particularly from, if you look at as early as Solovey and Meyer, even went before Goleman in saying emotional intelligence, emotions can be measured. And with that first step, We measure how excitable someone is, how calm they are. If we can create a continuum of people who can maintain emotional control in their relationships. And again, we're blending these domains. And again, if you do the research, Goldman has 4, there were 5, and then it went back to 4. But basically they center around social capital and that social trust. And what characterizes that, of course, is the emotional bond. And if we look, when I came in the Air Force in 1990, I watched Full Metal Jacket was a movie that grossly displayed how a lack of emotional intelligence can build sociopathic and psychopathic tendencies in people when they're broken all the way down to nothing, have no hope, have no way of relief, and how that can be self-destructive. Although that is an extremely dynamic example, an extreme example of that. I think it was, in my coaching job, I look back at these pop culture examples to highlight how far we've come and how far we have to go. So I think in both realms of emotional leadership and emotional education, I think, at least in the continuum that goes into developing an educator. I went through academic instructor's course. I took some private education. I took on-job training as I became an AT, but really emotional intelligence it's hard to find a lot of expertise on it because, if you look at Solovay and Meyer, they were 95 or 90. Goldman came a little bit later, and there's been a whole bunch of emotional intelligence folks. So it's hard to find certification and education on it. But I encourage us to do that as an enterprise in order to make us more lethal, not necessarily being able to, jump over buildings with a single bound, but to be able to figure out a more intellectual and emotionally intelligent way to create environments where our best come forward freely. We get self-directed learners, we get the emotional capital and emotional trust and bonding that further can create a community of practice among students in a class or members of an organization or a unit. So
Absolutely.
That's how the research I found kind of points to that. So thanks, Doc. I'd like to get the Colonel involved here. Thank you, Dr. Funches, for your insight. Colonel Bottomley, from your perspective in your career as an educator and a warrior, how has emotional intelligence impacted you, and what's some research that you've found that is particularly interesting that you'd like to share?
I appreciate that. And so, first of all, to all the folks that are listening, the only reason that I get invited to be on this panel is because I advised a paper this year that deals with emotional intelligence, and it won an award. And so you would think that because I advised it, that the author of the paper would be here. But unfortunately, he's in the middle of a PCS, which is a military move from one location to the other. And so one of my students this year at the Air War College wrote his paper on emotional intelligence. I do have background in emotional intelligence as well, with a master's degree in psychology, and I get very emotional, and so therefore I have personal emotional experience with emotions. I'm sorry, not very good intelligence with emotions. But so let me go through some of that paper, because I'd be remiss if I went through my talk without talking through Lieutenant Colonel Damon Sheffield's paper. And so his paper, Lieutenant Colonel Damon Sheffield is an active duty military police officer in the United States Army. He was a Air War College student this year. Previous to this year, he was the commander of a 701st Military Police Battalion at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And so again, I'm an airman, an Air Force airman. He's an Army soldier. And he's often dealing with anybody, as we've already talked about, around the realm, no matter whether you're in business, civilian or military, you deal with emotions, and having a grasp, having an understanding of emotional intelligence is very helpful. And so Lieutenant Colonel Sheffield's paper wrote, and he premised that emotional intelligence has been extensively studied in leadership across different realms of leadership by numerous scholars that have already been mentioned. He went through in his research paper and documented the history of some of the literature. But his premise is that the U.S. Army needs to adopt emotional intelligence into their Army leadership model. And so he said that as they adopt the more emotional intelligence, he says the Army acknowledges the role of emotions, but that they don't actually adopt emotional intelligence. And since it's not adopted as a formal role of leadership, then therefore it's not necessarily trained and it's not developed. And so one of the premises, again, that Lieutenant Colonel Sheffield, Damon had was that you could train and you can develop emotional intelligence. And he said he gathers that both from his own personal experiences as a commander and as a soldier, but then also from the historical research, again, by the authors that we've already mentioned. He says that the research that he published, and by the way, I didn't mention that his paper won the #1 paper for the Air War College for all the soldiers that wrote papers this year. And so it was a great paper that he wrote, and it's a shame that he wasn't able to be here with us today. But he wrote that the U.S. Army has been challenged with mental health issues, sexual harassment, assault cases, discrimination, extremism, suicides in recent years. And again, that's a documented fact. And in fact, I think we would all agree that those things that he mentioned there, mental health issues, sexual harassment, assault cases, discrimination, extremism, suicides, those are part of society. Those are something that all of society deals with, right? That's something that businesses deal with. That's something that our university students deal with, is all those type of things. And so what he says is that if the Army were to incorporate emotional intelligence into their leadership model, that again, it would be part of the training program for leaders. And then therefore he believes that the studies show that you could reduce some of those social issues that we have if both our leaders were more emotionally intelligent, and then also by doing that, they were mentoring their subordinates, the people below them, to be more emotionally intelligent. And then also they were more aware when they had subordinates, they had peers that were struggling with events. They weren't necessarily able to express with their words, but maybe were expressing with their emotions. And so he goes on and goes through the Army leadership model and talks about the different parts of that. Somebody who's not intimately familiar with it, somebody who's not a soldier, you might have heard this phrase before: the be, no, do. You've got to be a person. And so part of that Army leadership model, the be part of it in this circle, this pie chart, is your character and your presence. Having character and having presence. And then you have to know what you need to do. And so part of that is the intellectual aspect of it. And then lastly, and this would go back to like James Rest theory on moral courage and such, is that you can be a certain type of person and you can also know what to do, but until you actually do it, then you haven't been, in his case, morally courageous. But so in this case, the Army says you're not being a leader if you have character and presence and you also know what to do, but you don't actually do it. And so part of that model says that you've got to actually lead other people. You've got to develop yourself and develop other people, and then you get results and such. So that's the leadership model. And what Lieutenant Colonel Sheffield proposes is that if we were at an overlay of the emotional attributes, emotional intelligence attributes and competencies on that model, and specifically as he goes through that, again, you were just talking about the Goldman and McKee studies showed that self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management are specific parts of emotional intelligence that need to be incorporated into, and then it's a perfect overlay. And so self-awareness correlates with character and intellect in that Army leadership model. Self-management relates to a leader's attribute of being present, having a presence. That social awareness has to do again with the character and competency of leaders, and building empathy and trust, and demonstrating trust and demonstrating empathy. He goes through, and another thing that I loved in the paper was the talk on emotional intelligence related to transactional and transformational leadership. And so, again, you folks are probably familiar with transactional leadership, and I won't go through all of that, and transformational leadership. And so to say that a leader has to have emotional intelligence and actually demonstrate emotional intelligence and exercise it to be a leader, I think it's a little bit inaccurate, because you could be a very effective in a short-term transactional leader and not have emotional intelligence, because we know transactional leadership is based on rewards and punishments. And so I can motivate someone to do what I want them to do. If prison guard can motivate prisoners to go where they want them to go, or again, we'll talk about a sergeant that's overseeing enlisted folks that are going through basic training, is a very transactional approach. But that's only, and then I love to use the prison guard analogy, because a prison guard is only effective when the prison guard is standing there. Because in the case of a classroom teacher, if you have run your classroom or you're leading through transactional approaches, then when you're present in the classroom, everybody's behaving. And it doesn't take much emotional intelligence to do that. But the transformational leadership style very much is based on motivation. And so there's a very much a motivation aspect of that leadership. And what you want is to transform the way that person views themselves and the way they view you as the leader, and then also the way they view the task that you're both given to accomplish. And that's the part. So if you aspire to be a transformational leader, which we should all aspire to be, then you're going to require emotional intelligence. And that emotional intelligence is going to be a critical aspect of you knowing what's going to motivate your students or what's going to motivate your subordinates. And then and when you're enacting some type of leadership directive or skill, and if it's not being received properly, or if it's not being effective, it's having that emotional intelligence to feel that presence from the other person that this is not being effective. And so I'll stop at that and just say that I thought it was a great paper that Damon wrote. I really appreciated. So if he's had an opportunity to watch this now, or if he's going to watch it later, he did a great job on the paper. I thought that I highly encouraged him as we continued on through the process of, again, writing a paper. And if anybody out there ever writes paper, to get an award-winning paper, it takes multiple iterations. So Damon went through multiple iterations of writing this paper on emotional intelligence. And I encouraged him that I think this is something that if the leadership in the Army will listen to it, then I think it does have an opportunity. Again, the things that I've mentioned before, if you can't tell, I've got some of my notes here on a computer screen. But imagine if again, he could, and his premise is that they could reduce mental health issues, sexual harassments, assault cases, discrimination, extremism, suicides. If you could reduce suicides by improving leaders' emotional intelligence, then why wouldn't you do it? And so, again, a great paper. I really enjoyed working with him on it, and I highly encourage the Army to adopt some of his recommendations.
So that brings
questions for me, Mike.
Well, that brings a good point. Having seen student work, and some of it is supreme. Some of it is absolutely supreme. I had some chiefs, come together and publish a work that found its way in the Air and Space Power Journal, but that was such a rare thing, and I thought that was such a shame. So with folks like the Colonel and our students creating great points of research, how come it's not getting, when we come to PME or we come to school, no one has real visions of creating doctrine changing research in their work. Everyone wants to graduate and do well, represent themselves, but sometimes, or maybe that's us as stewards of our institutions to impart that look, you guys can really affect something enterprise-wide if you put your mind to it. But why do you think, and you're in a great position, I think, in my opinion, to maybe answer this, sir, why is it so hard to, a lot of my students would say, look, I do my great work. I highlight these we have a pool of 12 chiefs. We got them for a month. There's hundreds of years of service between us all. Why aren't we getting a more direct path to command? In the old argument that doctrine has destroyed the art in warfare, because doctrine is right. We've shown that it works. We don't have to be as creative once we find out what works, is what I hear from a lot of students. But if we get emotional intelligence students, leaders that are going to go out, how can we, in your opinion, and I know it's a big question, how can we open those channels to command when we as educators or just find people that have got it right we're qualified in our experience? How do we get that to the front? How do we get these thoughts to the trigger pullers?
I think it's about having heart, and it's about caring what you do. It's about seeing value. And so the way I ended that last little diatribe, my talk, is that if his premise is correct, is that you will reduce all those things, including suicide. So let's just focus on the suicide. If you can reduce suicides by increasing emotional intelligence, then you start to take ownership and going, you know what, this is not just an academic test. This is not just an academic exercise that we're doing. We're actually talking about real people's lives. And you mentioned trigger pullers, and so that's an aspect. If you can increase the skills and abilities of a trigger puller, then you would do that. But in this case, he's talking about saving people's lives through emotional intelligence. So I think it's about both the student viewing what they're doing as having value and not just an academic exercise of I'm going to put some words on a piece of paper and I'm going to turn it into you. You're going to put some red on it and we're going to have a grade and we'll be done. And I will tell you that honestly, when students come to me at the beginning of the year, so all of our students come and they have to write a research paper. And so there's a part of it where I'm going to force you to write a paper. So as a dean, part of our curriculum, I'm going to force you to do a research. And so part of it is a little bit of external motivation. So that transactional, yes, I'm going to force you to do this. But then when students come to me and say, hey, Colonel Bottomley, would you be the mentor for my paper? And as I talk through them what they want to write on, one of the first questions I ask them, honestly, is what do you hope to get out of this paper? Because if that student, honestly, if they have no personal motivation, if it's, and I'll ask them and they'll look at me like, what do you mean? What do I want to get out of this paper? And, are you, and so I'm feeling them out as we're going through this, as in how much of my time and emotion am I going to invest in your paper if really all you want to do is get a B and move on?
Right.
And so when a student says, and I'll go through, are you looking for just a B and moving on? Because I'm not going to require that many iterations, assuming you can do the work, it's not going to require that many iterations. But if you're looking to make a change, if you're looking to not just get an A, so I'm not, we can get you to an A, but if you're looking to make a change, and that's going to take some deep thought for you. That's going to take multiple iterations. That's going to take maybe reaching out to a senior mentor. And so that's another part. So when we start talking about specific things in the military, reaching out to a senior mentor in the Army or reaching out to a senior mentor in your service, or if you're in civilian education, reaching out to a dean at your school and go, hey, I'm working on this. Or if you're in business, reaching out to a vice president or maybe the CEO and say, I'm working on this project. Would you be willing to oversee it? Now, what you've done then is you've made a commitment by yourself to that person. So if you're working in business and you go to your vice president and say, I'm working on this paper about how emotional intelligence will help us with our customer service. I'm getting into Dr. Vanessa's realm here, so I apologize. You can correct me when I'm wrong.
No,
but if you go to your vice president and you say, I'm working on this to demonstrate how emotional intelligence will help us with our customer service, then now there's a commitment on your part, because if you drop off and you stop working on the project, now all of a sudden your vice president sees that Rock Bottomley says he's going to do something and doesn't follow through with it. But in this case, where now that's another form of accountability, if you will, that vice president saying, yeah, let me see the update on that paper, or the dean at your university, or in this case with he and I, me saying, hey, I'm interested in helping you with this paper. And I will tell you, again, let's go back to emotional intelligence between he and I, me and Damon, is that I could see, I'll be honest with you, I don't remember. I will say what I think I remember Damon saying. He said, sir, I just really want to get this paper done. I think he said, I just want to get this paper done. But as we went along, and I'm not going to put it on me that I did this, but as we went along, I encouraged him. I said, hey, this is a solid paper. You've got a good foundation for a paper. And so this is now to that senior mentor. This is now to that vice president or whomever. If you'll encourage people and you'll throw some positive emotion their way, then I remember Damon paper getting better and better, and he kept, wanting to work on it. And so all of those things is, I think, encouraging people to make a difference. And then once we get a paper like this, or whatever product, again, if you're in business, taking that and you've got to get it out. You got to advertise it to folks. I appreciate the folks that are putting on this research symposium, because this is an opportunity. All the people that are listening here, the places that this paper might be seen, then again, whether it impacts the Army, and I think it will, but it's, again, spreading the information. You can have a great idea, but until you put it on paper and share it with other people, that it's not going to change. So,
and I think it's a really slow change, Michael. It's not, this is not something, first of all, the military institution, just like the educational institution, is a stalwart, and we're not making any turns on a dime, right? It's going to be a very slow change, but you still have impact as a leader. Even just living this out, walking it out, having empathy, perhaps even making it okay to bring the emotional element in, and not say that doesn't make that you're not tough or you're not strong, or, just adding in that other piece. I think you show others, oh, wow, we can still be effective, or I'm more effective. And then they take that and they may walk it out that way as well. So I remember when I first became an associate dean, and I love quotes. And so I put a quote on my door that I thought was appropriate. And then a couple of weeks later, I realized everybody had quotes on their door. Right? And I was like, oh, and they were like, well, yeah, you're the leader. Everybody follows you. And I knew that already. But, then you see like, oh, okay, yes. So you do have a platform, if you will, where, kind of walking this out and putting this idea forward can change things, but it's a slow change. And just because it worked 200 years ago, I tell my students all that this worked in 1987, right? That's great, but that doesn't mean it's going to continue to work for forever. Elements change that we never thought would, and we have to stay on the cutting edge.
Right. Overcoming an entrenched mindset is also key to emotional intelligence, and
Yes.
being able to, in organizational systems, kind of have that clutch in to where I can get input. I can do atmospherics. I can do a smell, look, SILS check, my atmospherics, my metrics of my organization, find out how good they are learning. If I, as a leader, can do that, then I can create a more positive environment. And what I've found as military leaders specifically become more aware emotionally of their own intelligence, they're able to go, you know what, we've been doing it. We just didn't label it. We've come across empathy. We've come across sympathy. We've come across commanders that were organic. I used to call it the unicorn theory. I hoped that there would be the potential and the raw materials to work with, but there was no continuum to produce it. I had to hope against hope that there was a young troop ready to take something on. And instead of creating that sense of shared leadership through trust, empowerment, all those intangible things. And then we go back to whose military is more effective, the one that shows itself moving, shooting, communicating, or the one that is reflecting on a more holistic role of their service members, their families, how they live holistically, and not trying to force. It's a real paradigm shift, I think, for the military and in some corporate spaces. But I also think we kind of know how to do it. And as people, it's like name that tune, as people recognize the notes of emotional intelligence because they've heard this with one commander or this and how they lead, and it becomes a continuum, a formula of growth. I think we'll stay ahead of that innovation challenge, stay the most lethal force on the planet, and not have to, reflect the raw nature of military service, but rather the higher level of thinking that leads to being able to be emotionally intelligent. And Colonel, I would ask, we've shared a military heritage. How hard do you think it is for folks that are tenured, or the polite word, seasoned in service? How flexibly, Roger that. I forgot the powder to reduce.
I hit all mine. This is great. Yeah.
My lighting is wrong. My set director didn't show up today, but how hard?
My hair is actually black, but the lighting here makes it look great.
How hard do you think it'll be for us seasoned leaders, Colonel, to kind of turn the corner on this and look at changing how we educate, how we evaluate? If we look at learning the European curriculum model of lecture, exam, and competition, it's a centuries old way of learning. But like Dr. Funchess says, what if we have to change? How adaptive and agile do you think we are now in our role in adapting a different way to raise leaders and to teach?
Well, I do think that the challenge is on the folks that have been around for a while, because emotional intelligence, while we've mentioned the history of it in academia, it's not necessarily something that's well rooted in a lot of organizations. And so while in academia, it's been something that's been written about, and psychology has been written about, it's not something that a lot of organizations have placed a lot of value. Again, this is, for example, this paper that Damon wrote, is that he's saying, hey, Army leadership model, there's this thing called emotional intelligence that's been around for a while. The Army acknowledges emotions, but they don't incorporate emotional intelligence into the model.
And that's very specific.
Which would then lead to development and training, which then would lead to hopefully people doing it more often. It would be something that, again, Dr. Vanessa mentioned this from the very beginning, is let's talk definitions. And so until we put something on paper, then all of us can have different ways of thinking about emotions. But until we say emotional intelligence is this, and then I'm talking to a peer and we both have the same common definition of it, then I have a difficult time. It's like we're talking a little bit of a different language. So I think as we talk generations, the older generation might have, so that would be older generation in the military or older generation in a business, might have a little bit more difficulty coming on board with saying, hey, emotions do matter. Because again, transactional leadership has been around for quite a while. I want you to do this and I want you to do it now. And if you do it right, I'll give you a reward. And if you don't do it right, I'll punish you. That's classic leadership.
Absolutely.
This transformational leadership feels pretty squishy feely, but it's actually it's very effective because you get more at just the person. Instead of just getting the muscles for the person, you actually get their mind and their heart. And when you get a person's mind and heart, somebody, I think Nick mentioned, people want a connection. And so when you get that connection with somebody, then again, I'll go back to my analogy of the prison guard. When I get that connection with you, I don't have to stand here and watch you do it. And instead I can watch you perform. Because when I watch you do it, or I watch you do something as a leader, then all you're going to do is meet the bare minimum. But when I empower you, and I transform the way that you view yourself and the way you view me as your leader, and then also the way you view the task that we're working on, then now I can step back and watch you excel. And when I go to work on another task with someone else, you continue excelling on the thing that you're doing. So I think that, again, when people recognize this, and plus it's just good human nature to acknowledge this, that we have emotions, and emotions are part of us, And sometimes I will say that a person can be very emotionally intelligent and just have a bad day, but that's part of being emotionally intelligent and going, I'm having a bad day. I need a break or something. And then maybe you need to take some vacation time.
And that's important that you say that, because that's a limb fact for you. And if you're in a psychologically safe space, there's room for absolution, there's room for venting, there's room for bad days, there's grace for people's humanity. Folks, want to wrap up with a couple points. Nick also asked about like Dungeons and Dragons and how psychologists in schools are using that in extracurricular groups to help socialize kids, develop critical thinking and problem solving. The emotional intelligence kind of aspect in a tabletop for military training is absolutely something, Nick, that could be forged with the right people and the right resources and the right mindset. And I like that because it appeals to people that may feel more comfortable approaching emotional intelligence in a gaming scenario. And then Matt said, again, what you value is what you commit the most effort to. When you value people, the mission will follow. So there's some great insight here. And it sounds like folks have some great entrance thoughts into this, and we encourage everybody. I'd like to personally thank everybody for their time and attention, and MGM Works and Joyce and the gang for putting this on. Dr. Funches, Colonel Bottomley, our time is done. Thanks to everybody. We got to hand it over to Joyce. So thanks, Stock. Thanks, Colonel. Thanks, everyone.
What a pleasure. Yes.
Doc, real quick, what was that website that Mind Tools? I'd like to enter
www.mindtools.com, and mine is MIND.
Yep.
Tools.com, and it's a great resource.
Got it. Got that in the chat. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Colonel, Doc, I'd like to hand it over to Joyce.
I need to say one last thing to Doc, though. War Eagle.
Roll Tide.
Thank y'all. Thank you for letting me be part of this.
Awesome. And that had to happen. Of course, that had to happen. Thank you all. Thank you, Michael, Vanessa. Thank you, Mr. Bottomley. Thank you all for being on this conversation and speaking about the students' paper. I'm going to quickly turn it over to Dr. Ali, the Director of Academic Services at Air University, who's going to give us a few closing words as we finish out the Air University Research Showcase. Dr. Ali.
Hey there, everybody. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. Hey, this was a wonderful two-day event. Lots of rapid fire ideas. We haven't had at AU for quite some time a kind of enterprise-wide, institution-wide symposium, conference, showcase, however you want to phrase it. We appreciate everyone's contributions to this because it's overdue and it was well received. And I know some of the attendance numbers varied depending on people's availability, but again, this will all be available. The recordings will be available, and we're hoping that this many of the panel discussions and the content will be, broadcast out, maybe even kind of integrated into the curriculum here at AU and beyond. So very exciting, and thanks for all the participants. I learned a lot. I wasn't able to hit every moment of every session. I had a few other meetings, but, I learned things like, the Russian proxies and space policy and blood banks. I knew nothing about blood banks. And sort of, my thought about blood banks is, oh, there's always going to be blood, no problem, right? And hearing the panelists discuss the kind of the frailties of that whole operation when you're talking large scale. We had some nice diversity and inclusion issues brought up yesterday, and just a host of different, a smorgasbord, as they say, of different ideas. I want this, I think the most important thing that I want folks to take away from is this is an opportunity to continue the conversation, right? The fact is that we were able to get some great student research and other partners connected to that to bounce ideas off and come up with, kind of furthering the thinking. I think is a long-lasting output on here. I have one of my colleagues wrote this a long time ago, and it says, I think it's very connected to today and yesterday's presentation. It says, she said, great ideas flourish best when they can make the leap from one person's paper to a dynamic conversation by bringing multiple perspectives to the table. And that's what has happened this last couple of days. And I think I want, my unofficial charge, because I can't do this, but my plea is continue these conversations. I'm hoping that many people traded contact information as they get to know each other through the preparation and the presentation of the showcase. There's a lot of work to do, right? We're in serious competition mode, unlike years back, and we need to be on top of our game, and we need to break down the barriers to this knowledge. I think in the past, part of the operation here is the wonderful Air University Library. We have tens of thousands of student papers, and some might say, some students write in a vacuum, and so the faculty member might see it, and then it goes up on a shelf or in a digital archive. And then if somebody happens to be researching, they might discover it, but maybe not. And I think, again, doing these public presentations, further promotion of that. We're going to be doing a launch of our integrated library system platform later this month, actually, and we're going to be able to break down some of the kind of firewalls to access these all the student papers that come through AU. So we're very excited about that opportunity, and be on the lookout for that coming soon. Make a one quick plug for the Air University Press, which is part of the academic services team. There's a number of papers that were either presented or not, and we've got multiple venues under the AU Press umbrella to consider for publication. So I think we'll be reaching out to several of the presenters and working with them to further promote their ideas in these conversations. So, well, look, it's late in the day. Wanted to kind of offer some big thanks to a lot of our friends and doers, the big doers for this. We have our friends Rose Bloomfield and Nick Wells, masterful work to coach and do some of the IT support here. Thanks to you both for that. Our friends at MGM Works, General Trent Edwards and Joyce Vaughn, who really carried the torch for all this. Kudos to you, and it's always great to partner with you. And a special thanks to our Office of Sponsored Programs members, Dr. Ken Johnson and Margaret Sankey, especially the latter, who again worked with Joyce and a lot of the other players through MGM Works to make all this happen. So thanks very much to you. So don't let this be the last time we all get together. And thanks again, and looking forward to the continued conversations. Back over to you, Joyce.
Well, that was just perfect. You ended it so well. So I'm just going to say, hey, as Dr. Ali said, let this not be the last time that we get together. And thank you all for attending the